Good morning. I'm Dusky Terry, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
Welcome to the 2021 Iowa Ideas Conference. You're in the Energy and Environment track of the conference, where this hour we're talking about carbon sequestration and the future of ethanol. My name is Erin Jordan. I'm a reporter for the Gazette, and I've had the pleasure of working on many energy and environment stories for the newspaper and for Iowa Ideas magazine. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. As a reminder, the audience may submit questions through the Whova app, and we'll try to work as many of them into our conversation today as we can. So just to get started, you know, without carbon dioxide, the Earth's atmosphere wouldn't be able to absorb heat and sustain life. But human-caused increases to greenhouse gases have raised the Earth's temperature and already affected our global and local climate. Today, we're going to talk about ways to capture and store that carbon dioxide, and then discuss the future of ethanol, an important biofuel in Iowa. I've asked our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their connection to this topic. Let's go ahead and start alphabetically by last name with Steve.
Hi, Erin, and I want to thank you and Ideas 2021 for putting this forum together. My name is Steve Falk, and I was raised on a farm in Northeast Iowa, about an hour north of Cedar Rapids. And I farmed with my father for 10 years on our farm. Then I was elected to the Iowa House, served for 5 years. Then I moved over to the governor's office and worked in the policy shop with Governor Vilsack and Lieutenant Governor Peterson. After that was done, I worked for REG, Renewable Energy Group, a biodiesel manufacturer out of Ames. And now I'm with the Environmental Law and Policy Center and have been here for going on about 11 years. Some of the issues I work on, of course, climate decarbonization policy at the state and federal level, reduce reliance on coal power, increase renewables for energy generation such as wind, solar, and green hydrogen, energy efficiency, getting into now sequestration for transportation, advanced biofuels, renewable electric fuel, passenger rail, and then ecosystem restoration for water quality and soil health best practices. Thank you.
Ben, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Ben Gleason. I work for the Iowa Corn Growers Association and the Iowa Corn Promotion Board as a senior manager of sustainable programs. I was born and raised in Charles City, Iowa. On the Cedar River. Our family owns a few farms on the Cedar and the Little Cedar. We also have a cabin on the Cedar. So grew up hunting and fishing. Spent a lot of time with my grandfather out at the farm and at the cabin. So always been interested in natural resources issues. And so that's what I cover for Iowa Corn, everything from soil and water conservation to biodiversity and wetlands, pesticide issues, and of course now with climate change and how do we sequester carbon or use biofuels as an alternative to fossil fuels. Previously, I worked for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship as a watershed project coordinator for a few watersheds down in southern Iowa. So worked directly with landowners and farmers to implement conservation practices on their farm to improve that particular water body's issues.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Keel. I'm originally from Decorah up in Northeast Iowa. My professional career, I've been had past jobs with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and most recently with the Iowa Soybean Association. My current role is managing the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which is an ecosystem service program that operates in 10 states across the Midwest and into the Chesapeake Bay area. Our biggest footprint is in Iowa, where we've enrolled 80,000 plus acres of new conservation practices in things like no-till, cover crops, fertilizer management that produces both carbon sequestration outcomes, but also water quality outcomes that we monitor, verify, and transact with public and private customers that seek those outcomes, whether it be companies that have set climate reduction or carbon reduction goals, or public entities like USDA who desire water quality outcomes. We're connecting those interested parties with farmers who are willing to change their mode of operation to produce those valuable outcomes. Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Thompson. I'm the Markets and Technology Director for an organization called the Clean Air Task Force. For those of you who aren't familiar, we're an international nonprofit environmental group. We have staff in about 14 time zones across the world. Most of my work over the last 20 years for the Clean Air Task Force has been on carbon capture and storage, primarily in North America, but somewhat in China too. And I'm an engineer by background, and I live in Southern Illinois. I'm in Carbondale. So it's great to be with you and excited to be part of Ideas 2021.
That's great. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks for being here. So the biggest news in carbon capture in Iowa right now seems to be two proposals to build carbon pipelines to transport compressed carbon dioxide from ethanol plants and store it underground. One proposal is the $4.5 billion 2,000-mile pipeline proposed by Summit Carbon Solutions that would go through 5 states, including Iowa, on its way to North Dakota. The other proposal is a 1,200-mile pipeline by Navigator CO2 that would go through 5 states and end in Illinois. John, can you tell us how these pipelines would work in terms of collecting CO2 from ethanol refineries and then transporting it through a pipeline and storing it underground?
Sure. Let me just start with the basics. Why would anyone want to do this? And why would they want to do it on ethanol? So the basic reason is to lower the carbon intensity of ethanol so that it can command a higher price in markets that have low carbon fuel standards, places like California, the West Coast, and increasingly more and more states are adopting those. So by making ethanol have a lower score, having it less carbon intensive, it actually commands a higher price in the product. So that's what's driving this. And the other thing that's driving this is tax credits that are available at the federal level called 45Q. Right now, those are set for about $50 a ton of CO2 captured. But Congress, and we're working very diligently on this, are trying to raise this to about $85 a ton. And many of your Iowa legislators have been key in working on driving that to make this more economic. So ethanol actually has an advantage on carbon capture. At least the fermentation that comes off of those plants produces an extremely concentrated CO2 stream. It's almost 100% CO2. It only has to have water removed and then compressed so that it can enter a pipeline. So that can be done fairly cheaply. And what these two proposals, Summit Ag and Navigator, are seeking to do is to build a series of pipelines that would feed into a larger pipeline. And in the case of Navigator, send that CO2 into Illinois, where I live. And in the case of Summit Agriculture, send it north into North Dakota. And once this CO2 reaches its final destination, it is injected, probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles deep underground. This has been done in Illinois by ADM at their Decatur facility. They've been capturing over 1 million tons of CO2 and injecting it at a nearby site about 7,200 feet below the ground surface. At that point, the CO2 that's been in the pipelines has been compressed to almost a liquid-like stage. It's about 80 atmospheres. And at that density, it acts both as a gas and as a liquid. And what happens is that it displaces water in the rock pores deep below the earth and is trapped. And it's isolated from the environment. And at that point, it's likely to stay under there over geologic time. It eventually becomes part of the rock itself. So each of these proposals is roughly the same size, maybe 10 to 12 million tons. And I would say roughly 30 million or 30 plants each, something like that. And what I think is exciting for those of us who don't, say focus on farming like I do, is that these projects really show the way for how we can do this on some of the hardest to decarbonize sectors of the global economy: steel mills, cement plants, glass, fertilizer. These are areas that we're going to have to decarbonize, and it's really tough to do it in any other way except through carbon capture and sequestration.
So one question I have, and I think that we have an audience member who raised a similar question, is just about the safety of this. When you're putting this compressed carbon underground, I know you say ADM has had some time with this. Are there concerns about it causing problems, like tremors or different issues for residents, I guess, in the future, or us now?
Sure, great questions, and safety is exceptionally important. So we have a pretty long history of injection of CO2 below ground in the United States. Since about 1970, we've injected in the United States about 800 million tons of CO2 in Texas and the Gulf states for enhanced oil reduction, or in a process called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. There, the CO2 is injected into aging oil fields, and it displaces oil and brings it to the surface. And during that time, it had an excellent safety record. It's really been a very, very safe operation. So we have a lot of experience on that because essentially, if you have, for this process to work, you have to have rock traps above the place where you're injecting. And we know those rock traps have worked in oil fields because the oil is still there. If they didn't work, you wouldn't be able to, there just wouldn't be any oil. And we think is that with saline injection, where we're not doing it with oil here in the Midwest, we'll be injecting into these rock formations that contain brine. We have those same cap rocks. And so those, in combined, if we pick the right site, if we do the right monitoring, this is going to be very safe. Transportation, when you compress the CO2 into a liquid-like state, it is considered a hazardous liquid. It is regulated under these sorts of things. And you can understand why. If you have a break in a pipeline, the CO2 can escape. And if it were in a confined area or something, you could worry about things like suffocation. The good news is that the CO2 pipeline safety record has been excellent. We have about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines across the United States. Never had a fatality associated with them. We have had leaks, and generally those leaks have been fairly small. What is important about these pipelines is that they are set up with 24/7 monitoring, so that when there is a break, there's a signal sent, to a control room, and they can, almost instantaneously shut this off. But it still doesn't doesn't mean that this is like moving, water. You still have to do it safely. And I'm confident that this is a product that will match and exceed the safety standards that, have been in place for many, many years.
Thank you, John. So with most proposals, there's winners and losers. With these pipeline proposals, just throw this out to everyone in the group. Who stands to gain or lose from these pipelines?
I can go real quick. John mentioned the California low carbon fuel standard and similar policies on the West Coast, and certainly there's a premium for lower carbon intensity biofuels in those markets. So I think the potential winners and losers are those hooked up to this pipeline or either pipeline, and those who are not. We'll kind of see how that plays out, because obviously there's risks either way, and potentially, so you say you're not hooked up to the pipeline, well then maybe you have all the other ethanol markets are more open to you, because those hooked to the pipeline are sort of throwing all their chips into the California market. So it'll be, we'll see how things go, but there may be opportunity, especially internationally, to export ethanol down the river. We have a lot of countries out there interested in using more biofuels to replace fossil fuels, and they don't use 10 or 15% like we do in Iowa. So there may be an opportunity either way. Could be winners and losers, kind of both ways.
I would just like to note, Aaron, that the risks associated, and John talked about the safety, that there have been no deaths associated with any kind of a leak thus far. But there was a leak in Mississippi that was carbon plus other gases in the pipeline that were very corrosive. And so there are, some safety factors. We need to look at the infrastructure itself and the welds. I had heard that this pipeline might have x-rays on every weld. I'd like to learn more about some of that on the infrastructure itself. But the gas that leaked down in Mississippi, while there were no deaths, it was carbon as a gas is heavier than air. And so it was low to the ground. It enveloped this town, and there were a lot of sick people. And the first responders didn't know what they were dealing with. They had no idea what this was. And everybody that was breathing this got pretty sick. So, there are some cautionary flags I'd like to, kind of take another look at and hear about and learn more about of what this pipeline is going to be. Now, I think, John is right where ethanol plants emissions are mostly carbon. And if there are other plants that are looking to hook onto this pipeline, we really need to take a close look about, the cost of scrubbing out other chemicals so that it is just CO2 going into the pipeline, so that there aren't other gases that could cause problems for that infrastructure. And with anytime you have a pipeline, you're going across a lot of farmers' fields. And the last pipeline that went through, there was some promises made that weren't kept about putting the topsoil back on top. And so farmers were having problems with yield loss. So, we do need to do this right. If it's going to happen, it's got to be done right. Can't be trying to get by cheaply.
And I'll just go next, and because I think safety is really critical. Let me just say that we have in California, huge wildfires that have been caused by power lines. We don't say we're never going to build power lines because of those, even though they've been devastating and killed many, many people. We don't raise the fact that some of the electrons that went through those power lines came from renewables. You know, we just know that we have to build power lines safely. We know we have to increase the standards. It's the same challenge we have with any kind of infrastructure, including carbon dioxide. And I am in complete agreement with what Steve has said, that we have to put safety first. And we have to do this in a way that also addresses what, you know, farmers who, you know, who are along those pipelines and their impacts on their farm fields. What I think will happen with most of these pipelines is that they will use existing right-of-ways. That's important because that has the least impact on people. But I do believe that when you look at where these are going to happen and where they're going to happen first, we have the chance in Iowa to do it, you know, the right way the first time. And there's obvious benefits in terms of winners. Most of the, you know, probably 3/4 of, you know, of the corn that goes to these ethanol plants comes within 150 miles of each plant. I mean, almost all of it, perhaps. So there are real winners in terms of keeping those ethanol plants going. And I think that we will address safety. We have to address safety, just as we have to address safety on power lines. We have to do that with pipelines, we have to do it with power lines, we have to do it with everything. And infrastructure is just one of those things. But I think that if it's going to happen, let's best start in places like the Midwest, where, you know, people are pretty level-headed about how to go about doing these things.
A couple of quick questions from our audience. This one, Ben, I thought maybe you could answer. What percentage or what share of Iowa's ethanol plants are proposed to be hooked up to the pipelines?
I'm not sure about that. John, maybe you know.
Well, I don't really know, but I, you know, because I, you know, I think that all I know is it's about 30 over several states, each one of them. And I think the bulk of them are actually in Iowa. So it's a significant portion. But what percentage of that is, you know, of the total? I don't know. I think it's not unlikely, though, that over time, let's say over the next 15 years, you know, that more and more ethanol plants from more and more states will be doing carbon capture because we have to do it to protect the planet. And, you know, farmers understand better than anyone the importance of having reliable weather and a certain climate. So I think that there's positive reasons to do this. The economics are trending in the right direction. And I think that whatever the small number of these sort of pioneer projects that begin with, you know, ultimately in the next 15 years, I think we're going to see almost all of them.
So I was looking back, I had some notes quickly. There was a public meeting this week for the Summit pipeline, and I just looked at my notes, and there are 35 ethanol plants that will be connected to that, and 12 of them are in Iowa. They had said, I think that with the deals they have so far, that would be like about 3/4 of their capacity. So there may be room for other ethanol plants to come online at some point. And that's just with the Summit proposal. I'm not sure about the Navigator, but, and I think Iowa has what, like 40 or so ethanol plants, Ben?
Yeah, 42.
Okay. Okay, cool. And then another question from the audience, you know, even though underground CO2 has a relatively safe record in the last 50 years, you know, the question from the audience is who's held liable for long-term potential risks, particularly with underground storage?
So the monitoring period and the post-closure care period is 50 years. And in order to open up that underground storage site, they have to establish a trust fund in order to, you know, fund that long-term care period. They have to, you know, do that. They also have to, you know, work out arrangements with the landowners to get access to the property and to compensate them for the use of their pore space. So it's going to be, you know, these private companies, you know, who have to meet these regulations and have to establish these funds At least in most of the country, it's 50 years. In California, it's 100 years.
Okay, thanks.
One of
Well,
the
we may
things I
come,
was
oh, go ahead,
reading
Steve.
about, Aaron, just quickly, I think EPA requires a permit 6 to sequester carbon, which is similar to pulling out oil. And now I've got to kind of look into what that permit process is and what that covers. But I think, yeah, right, there's going to be funds set up that are going to be covering any type of other problem at the tail end.
Steve's exactly right. This is a Class 6 permit. And in order to get that permit, you have to do several things. First of all, you have to examine the geology, you have to do test wells. You have to establish something called the area of review, which is to figure out what's called the plume. When you inject the CO2 and it expands underground, where will it touch? What are those areas where it might reach? And will you be monitoring for those kinds of things? It's a pretty extensive permit, and the wells that you have to build under these are pretty stringent standards in terms of the casing, in terms of the depth, in terms of the monitoring. But I think that it's one of those things that as we do even more, I suspect that the regulations will get tighter. That's just been my experience over the last 20 years with environmental regulations. They don't get weaker, they get stronger. But I think that we have the opportunity to build on a track record, to set out and get the regulations stronger. I think that one of the areas that that Iowa can help do is to sort of pioneer even stronger regulations on transport, and help us to get even stronger ones on injection. I think they're excellent standards right now, and we just have to always be making them better.
Okay, changing gears a little bit, there are also agricultural practices that can sequester carbon. Adam, what are the best ways we know of at this point to store carbon on the farm, and how can we increase use of those practices?
Yeah, so great question. So John talked about the technology solutions to lower the carbon intensity score of biofuels. You can also implement conservation on the farm to lower the carbon intensity scores in the production of either corn or beans that are used in the biofuel industry. So the most common practices on the farm are going to be those that reduce the tillage operations that farmers do, right? Going from a single or multiple tillage passes to no-till. That's a great way to store and keep carbon in the soil. Cover crops are another way to pump some CO2 down in the soil profile. And we can't forget about the other greenhouse gases, and especially nitrous oxide, that are emitted from crop production as well, and the opportunities to adjust fertilizer application rates to lower the nitrous oxide emissions. I know we're talking about carbon, but we need to also understand that these other greenhouse gases have a big impact on the climate. So those are three, pretty simple, relatively simple practices that could be implemented to store carbon in the soil and reduce nitrous oxide emissions.
So a question I have, and that an audience member has, what do you think is one of the greatest challenges for farmers to adopt these practices, and what would you like to see Congress or the Iowa legislature do to help us achieve those goals?
Yeah, there's a couple things right now. The USDA is looking at a climate smart partnership initiative where they would kind of de-risk the adoption of those practices for farmers in exchange for the storage of carbon in soils. I think that's a great start. Really what it comes down to is, what's the market telling farmers to produce and how to produce a crop, and what's the risk profile of making that change on farm. If there's a financial incentive to produce a crop in a low carbon or a climate friendly manner, I think farmers will respond. It's just it's a different way of delivering conservation that's been delivered before, mostly through government subsidization or cost sharing of conservation practices. But now, if there's market signals to produce a certain way, either for a low carbon intensity feedstock for biofuels or for another food or ag supply chain, I think that's an opportunity to send farmers those signals that these practices are ones that are going to be around and, perhaps at some point needed to enter a market.
I would just like to add, Aaron, that when I think of a farmer, what he can do on his own operation, I think of avoided emissions first. What can you stop doing to avoid emissions? Because that can be an immediate improvement and immediate change. And as Adam said, trips across the field, transitioning into no-till, where you're using less fuel consumption. You may be able to get by with smaller equipment. So there are things that can avoid emissions, and those are just a couple. And then there are things, putting carbon into the soil. Now, cover crops, any kind of a green cover, something growing year-round can help with this taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in the soil. The complexity, though, is measuring how much. Soil organic carbon is not an easy thing to measure. It can be costly, up to, I've seen estimates of around $15 or so per acre or more. And this is a slower process. This isn't something that's going to be an immediate change because of just the complexities of measuring how much soil is actually stored in the soil. Different soil types store different amounts of soil. We have about 470 different soil types in Iowa. So getting, I think of one of my fields up in Northeast Iowa has about 6 to 8 different soil types on it. Soil types kind of follow the topography of the landscape. If it's higher ground, different soil type than what's on the lower ground or on the slope. So measuring that, I think there are some models that can help with that. I know that Iowa State is working on this, but there's a lot of, how much, measuring. When I was testing for soil fertility, I was going down about 8 inches to take a soil sample. Well, for measuring soil organic carbon, you've got to go 2 to 4 feet down because you got to get down into the root zone and the different soil profiles. Again, there's the different soil types. So that it's very complex, but I would say, what can a farmer do to avoid emissions first? I think that would be something that's more immediate.
Aaron, one more thing to add, and John mentioned the 45Q tax credit for some of these more tech solutions like pipelines. Perhaps there's additional incentives and, throw tax credits in the mix for these nature-based or green solutions that are kind of working on the other end of the crop supply chain, kind of as they're produced. So that's just an idea that's maybe worth thinking about in the future.
Ben, I just wanted to open that up to you too, just, in terms of solutions, things that you've seen folks try through the Corn Growers Association. What do you think would be maybe most successful?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Adam, reduced tillage, cover crops, and nutrient management are sort of the 3 big ones as far as reducing greenhouse gases and sequestering carbon. But they also have, multiple benefits for water quality, soil conservation, and soil health. So there's opportunities there as the state has incentives for water quality practices. Our federal programs have the same. So, and then, USDA, as Adam has mentioned, is, how do we use those same types of programs that farmers are familiar with to incentivize the climate smart practices in the same way. So we know that, our local soil and water conservation districts are known by the farmers, as a place to go for conservation issues. So it makes sense to continue using that system for climate practices as well. But, what I hear from farmers who have been adopting these practices over the years is, obviously, not everyone wants the government handout to implement these practices. So they really want to know what is the economic benefits to their farm. We've mentioned reduced passes across the field. So obviously that saves on fuel costs. So there's a savings there. Can you reduce fertilizer application because you're not losing as much nutrients through water or through the air? Do you have improved weed control because of the cover crop? What kind of savings, and then can you add all that stuff up and pay for the practice? We're still struggling with putting exact dollars and cents on those practices. We know there's all these benefits, but penciling it out for each individual farm and each individual soil type can be difficult.
No, just a couple questions from the audience that I want to get into, but before that, Steve, how have you seen policy, whether that's California policy, federal policy, drive innovation when it comes to reducing carbon emissions or sequestering carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question, because many times policy does drive innovation, and that's really what we need in this instance. And so if there are value to having carbon credits or water credits in the eco-services system credits, having different credits on that same acre, that's another revenue stream for the farmer to help, as Ben was talking about, the cash flow. So the policy, the low carbon fuel standard, I think, has probably been one of the major innovators for advanced biofuels. That just was policy passed by California and now Oregon. And I know there are some states in the Midwest that are looking at a low carbon fuel standard. So I think we can improve on that policy to reflect some of the conservation farming practices farmers are doing now, so that model kind of helps that fuel, whatever's produced, is a lower carbon intensity. So that is, there's other policies that have incentivized, for example, electric fuel. And that has been driving innovation and when I'm talking about electric fuel, I'm really focused on renewable electric fuel, not electric fuel produced by carbon, but renewable electric fuel. So those are some examples of how policy has driven. I'd like to see some more soil health incentives so farmers can start engaging and using those practices to help them transition from tillage to no tillage. That's not an easy transition to go through. It requires different types of equipment. These incentives, I think, will help drive innovation. Farmers are very innovative. They'll figure out a way to make it cash flow if they know that there's a market for either whatever the product might be, or if they can make it cash flow.
A related question from an audience member. They asked, can you explain more about how the California standard works? Will ethanol from the Iowa plants that are sequestering carbon need to be shipped to California in order to qualify for the preferential pricing? Or does California look at the carbon intensity of the fuel source as a whole? I think they just have several questions on that front. Anyone can add to that answer.
So let me just start with what I know of it, and others can chime in and so on. So first of all, the ethanol has to be sold in California, and that means that the fuel has to somehow make it there, and how much of that bonus you get for using it is determined by a carbon intensity score, and a lot of things can affect that intensity score. And, we've talked about, say, carbon capture as a way of removing CO2 and lowering that score. But there are other ways, different, efficiency sorts of things, different, sources of that ethanol, using different sources of heat to drive the fermentation. It could be that you're using renewable natural gas instead of methane that comes from under the ground. So there's a lot of ways to lower that carbon intensity score. And the ethanol people that I've spoken to are really trying to get to carbon negative. What they're trying to reach is not just lowering it, but getting to the point where they're actually at, a net no net emission as a result of the use of that product.
The models that are used to come up with that carbon intensity score go from cradle to grave. And what that means is it starts from the production, how much fuel does the farmer use to plant corn, that kind of thing, to all the way to tailpipe emission. So it captures the transportation, it captures the conversion, it captures, that total carbon intensity that went to make that either that feedstock, because it can vary by feedstock or vary by fuel source or fuel type, meant to say, yeah.
Yeah, just to piggyback on John and Steve's comments, the ethanol plants are becoming much more efficient, producing more ethanol per bushel of corn. They're using, lower carbon intensive energy sources, like John said, the heat sources, or recycling the heat, that lowers the score. The feedstock, the corn and the beans that go into the biofuels are becoming more precise with fertilizer management. There's, increasing soil organic carbon. And now we have these, carbon sequestration pipelines. So all these things add up and lower the carbon intensity score for these fuels, and make them more attractive to the California market, where typically they ship the fuel by rail to that market where it's delivered and used.
And I'll just add, one of the policy recommendations that the Agriculture Working Group is going to make to the task force, the governor's task force on sequestration, is low carbon farming. And I think that really makes sense to start focusing on what does that mean and what are the practices? How can I lower my carbon intensity score on my farm and on my products that I sell, to the market, soybeans and corn? Because I'd like to see, some of the conversion facilities say to the farmers, look, we're only going to take no-till corn as a feedstock. That guarantees their carbon intensity score will be much lower than if it's a tilled corn. So that's just an example of, low carbon farming. I think makes sense, and it will help with our water quality as one of the benefits.
And we talked a lot about the California market, but as Steve and others have pointed out, there's, opportunities for other states, or, Canada is in fact discussing a low carbon fuel standard expansion. So, we're kind of catering right now to California and kind of West Coast market generally, but, if there was low carbon fuel standard mandates in the Midwest, or, closer markets, there would be a good driver there for production in the Midwest to meet that more localized demand.
And I will just say that, what I don't see an ethanol versus electric fuel debate. I know we might be talking about it in a little bit, but I just wanted to make that point up front to some people in the audience that I think we can do both.
So we're having such a great discussion here. We're going to run out of time before too long, but I wanted to talk briefly about carbon trading. It's a market-based system to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by creating incentives to do that. In some voluntary markets, companies that want to reduce their carbon emissions might choose to buy carbon offsets. And to all the panelists, what markets are you aware of, and are they working?
Yeah, I'll go first. We're directly involved with the voluntary carbon market, and there's kind of two different categories of carbon that are occurring. There's the carbon offset, which is a pretty regulated trading. It's fungible credits that are tradable across sectors. And that historically has been, forestry or more permanent type land use changes that have produced those carbon credits that are, as I mentioned, fungible and tradable. But then you see many companies today, a footprint in Cedar Rapids is Cargill has set a greenhouse gas or carbon reduction goal of 30%. And to do that, they really need to reduce the carbon intensity of their goods and services they procure. And biggest among those is corn and soybeans. So when carbon improvements occur in the supply chain of a company, that's called an inset. And that insetting opportunity is becoming bigger and bigger as more companies set these net zero goals or a reduction goal like Cargill has. So you're going to see an emphasis more so on insetting, I believe, because Iowa agricultural products are used in many supply chains, and many companies that use those goods and services are setting goals. So you're going to see a lot more insetting, but in the short term, the carbon offset market, this regulated market, is what people are familiar with, and they know about that, and that's drawing a lot of the attention, and it's kind of in a sense confusing the issues here. But there is going to be a growing carbon market, whether it's an offset market or an inset market. Is kind of time will tell what market we see, but my prediction is we'll see a lot of inset market opportunities where companies are urging conservation improvements in the supply chain for agricultural commodities.
Yeah, I would just add that, I agree that inset is probably the first thing to get done first, and that has been voluntary. That's what I call scope 3 emissions. So you have companies like General Mills or Quaker Oats, go to their supply chain and say, you need to lower your carbon intensity score for whatever you're doing. It isn't directly affecting their plant operations, but it's in the supply chain. And so that's another one of the recommendations our working group is going to recommend are the scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. But when we get to offsets, even with insets, what I'll say one of the protocols is MRV. That's monitoring, recording, and verification. That is going to be a really complex protocol, and I think we need to have, we have several different third-party private groups right now, as Adam mentioned, out there, but it's kind of like the Wild West. We need these protocols to have some standards, and they really need to be defined by USDA. So USDA is coming up with, they're working on a carbon bank, which would help define some of these protocols. I think once we have the protocols defined, then everybody can operate under the same rules. It's sort of like organic farming. There are different standards and protocols for being certified, USDA certified organic farming. And that has then allowed the market to flourish because everybody's playing under the same rules. So we really need USDA to step in with the framework for the protocols on, everything from additionality to permanence. All of these are really complex concerns. We have an opportunity to help USDA maybe define what some of these protocols are. And I hope that's what this, the task force can help USDA with this, that we think that this would work here in Iowa. So we would think it would work, around the country.
Is there any support for making any of these required? We've got all these voluntary markets. What about regulation?
That's always a possibility. I think if I had to make a prediction, sooner than regulation is going to be a market demand from companies that are buying products from farmers, right? They may say, we're only going to buy corn that's produced, to kind of use Steve's earlier comment, using no-till, right? So that I think that's something that farmers may face in the not too distant future is production requirements that are climate smart or climate friendly in order to sell into a certain market.
Yeah, and right now it's all voluntary, and other what I'll say cap and trade schemes that have worked is when you have the regulation of a cap, and that cap would be on emissions. For example, coal plants or other energy generating plants or anybody that uses coal. If you have a cap on that coal, well, then that carbon credit becomes much more valuable. Right now, we're operating under voluntary, which is, fine, let's get the system set up, see that it's working. work out the kinks, let's get the protocols right. And then eventually we may need to look at some type of further regulation.
Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, just regarding the voluntary, markets, if, using Steve's example of a, ethanol plant asking for no-till corn, that'd be great. What we haven't seen yet is, is that ethanol plant or food company or whoever's using that feedstock, are they willing to pay a premium for that bushel? Or is that company's customers, the consumers, willing to pay a premium for this, higher standard? And we haven't really seen that yet. So I think, that's kind of could be a huge driver of moving that sort of system forward.
Well, we're almost out of time. I didn't realize it didn't go till 11:30. We're ending at 11:20 here. So I guess I just, it's been a great conversation here, and I've loved all the questions from the audience members. So thank you so much for our panel for joining us to talk about carbon sequestration and the future of ethanol. Thanks to Adam Keel, John Thompson, Ben Gleason, and Steve Falk. There are several other energy and environment discussions today, including one on building the power grid at 3:10 p.m. and one on energy storage that I'll be moderating this afternoon at 4:20. So thank you so much again to our panelists and to the audience members for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Aaron.